WWH show. This is a show that asks a series of why, what, and how questions on topics that have national, regional, and international significance and implications. Such a topic is today here for discussion, which is why the current food aid scheme is not benefiting the poor. In this studio today, I have an esteemed expert who have written books and articles on the same subject to discuss with me about why the current scheme of food aid is not benefiting the poor. His name is Dr. David Phillips. He is an expert in this topic. Dr. Dave, thank you very much for coming by taking your precious time from your busy schedule. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
You know, this program asks questions about why to provide background information and also to find out the root causes and also what to identify what's going on. Yeah. And then the how question to propose some solutions to fix the problem. So let's begin our discussion with the why question. Why do you think in the first place donor organizations and nations decided that they should use food aid in the fight against poverty?
In actual fact, I don't think donor organizations originally saw food aid as being used in the fight against poverty. The origin of the food aid program, I think, in the United States was in the 1950s, was as a means of getting rid of agricultural surpluses. This was the key reason. And the second most important reason was probably a pursuit of export markets for U.S. agricultural products. And it was decided that you could combine these objectives with maybe some help to the poor. But if we see the food aid programs as originating in that way, basically commercial and even political or diplomatic objectives, then we can see that they were not necessarily developmental in the first place. And my view is that if aid programs or assistance programs are designed from the start not as developmental but as commercial or political, then they're unlikely to be made developmental down the road. And I think this is probably one of the major explanations as to why food aid has never really been a developmental program. And yeah.
So they have been investing, for example, since 1950s for the past more than 5 decades. Around $1 trillion have been transferred to poor countries, but no change. And as we can see right now with that, I don't see that poverty can be eradicated, let's say, in the coming couple of years or decades. So why donor organizations and recipients continue to promote and continue to embrace this food aid program?
Well, the $1 trillion you're talking about applies to all aid. So that aid is currently running at about $140 billion a year. That is to say, aid as defined as being subsidized programs. And out of that, food aid is actually a very small proportion. Food aid, total world food aid is currently running at only about, I think, $4 or $5 billion a year out of 130, 140. So we're really talking about, say, 4%. 4% of the world aid program is actually food aid. So food aid is quite small.
So what are the other developmental aid programs? And do you believe that they are very productive in terms of eradicating poverty?
Well, in my book, I really am concerned with this particular problem. I'm really concerned with the broad problem. I look at the cost and benefits of aid, not in terms of projects, but in terms of systems. And one of my principal arguments is that the systemic cost of foreign aid is too high in relation to the benefits that it can achieve. And the benefits that it can achieve are also quite sometimes difficult to identify. But when you consider the costs, and I don't mean the costs to the giver, I mean also the cost to the recipient, in terms of absorbing the aid, in terms of the reorganization of government to use the aid, and in terms of the systemic effects on, for example, people's consumption patterns, people's behavior, people's expectations, and the effects also on things like governance. These are key costs to foreign aid, and this is really outside the food aid problem as such.
So now can we conclude that the current scheme of food aid is not benefiting the poor?
Well, let's divide food aid into two things. There's developmental food aid, so-called, and there's emergency food aid. When we're talking about emergency programs, the rules of the game are a bit different, because with emergency programs, you're dealing with an emergency, obviously. With developmental programs, you're dealing with a long-term question of how to develop a country, dealing with economic development. These are two very big, there's a big difference between these two things. Emergency, something has to be done very quickly to save lives. For development, you need to have properly designed assistance, if any assistance at all, designed to actually increase productivity over time. That's the sort of key issue. And food aid, interestingly enough, as I say, can be split into those two. So the humanitarian side of food aid is a different story from the developmental side. If you look at the US program, it's divided into several categories. But if you like, simplifying it a bit, you can say there's a developmental side, which they call program food aid, and there's a emergency side, which comes more out of project food aid or special emergency categories, emergency programs. And it's the developmental food aid side of this, which in my view is the one which is subject to the most doubt in terms of the things I was just talking about for development aid as a whole.
So now let's divide them into two. The food aid that targets, for example, in response to natural disaster, they're working fine because, people need food and they should be provided immediately. But the issue we have right now is about developmental aid. Yeah. But still there are, proponents, people who promote that food aid is for development is still very beneficiary to poor countries. And they justify, for example, that if you give food to poor countries, I think you are helping the hunger and also helping them to get immediate food. And also by giving them food, you could be able to prevent deficit because these poor countries, they don't need to import food using their hard currency. And also they argue that if you give food, for example, to their developmental efforts, in that case, it also promotes growth. Do you agree with that? Or so is it justifiable, or are there any negative sides you can see from this food aid program?
Well, first of all, let me say that even emergency aid can be better designed. For example, emergency aid, if it uses, say, for example, American food products, then it takes such a long time to deliver, unless you have pre-positioned emergency food supplies. It takes such a long time to deliver, and it's so expensive to deliver through U.S. shipping that those are two major problems, even with emergency food aid. But with developmental food aid, if it's supposed to be provided directly from the U.S. rather than from the local or regional areas, and if it has to come in U.S. cargo carriers, then the situation is you have very expensive food coming into the country. And then in the U.S. development food aid program, they use a system whereby food provided in the United States is actually sold in the local market and through various non-government organizations, foreign usually, and those foreign non-government organizations then use the cash proceeds of those sales in order to pay for projects. So effectively, the United States is subsidizing food exports in order to pay for various kinds of developmental projects, and instead of providing cash directly for those developmental projects. So very, very wasteful and inefficient procedure. And furthermore, the most tricky part of it is the fact that subsidize U.S. food exports, which go into the market and are sold into the market, are in direct competition with local suppliers. And we're talking about a non-emergency situation here. We're talking about a regular situation where subsidized food imports from the United States undercut or could undercut local markets and end up in reducing prices, so that the farmers may have to go out of business because they can no longer afford to sell at the costs it takes them to produce. So this is one of the major, shall we say, structural effects of food aid. And whereas emergency food aid, as I say, is a different kettle of fish, developmental food aid, there's very little justification for developmental food aid, which the United States is giving under this PL 480 program and a few others, and which is tied to American goods, tied to American shipping. I might add that Canada, the Canadian food aid program, is in a similar situation. And this kind of long-term food aid program, in my view, and according to the sort of things that I've been saying, has very little justification.
By the way, there are many experts who agree with you because they are arguing it that, yes, it cuts production because, think about it, not only food. For example, developed countries, if they give, let's say, production tools as aid or some materials, none other than, food. Still, this discourages local production because now local producers, they're competing with free products, so they don't really get any incentive to continue to produce. And also there are other side effects experts are arguing. For example, food aid program is encouraging, for example, corruption, conflicts, and so on, and also dependency on food.
Well, if you take the program I've been talking about, whereby American, say, wheat is sold in the market, and the proceeds of those sales in the market are then used to pay for imported equipment, say, for projects, that's a very, very complicated situation. And the more complicated it becomes, the more open it is to corruption, and misappropriation and false invoicing and all kinds of things like that. And I've always said that foreign aid has got to be done in a very, very simple, transparent, and understandable way if it is ever to be successful. And the food aid system, the monetized food aid system, is absolutely not, simple nor transparent. And as I said at the beginning of this program, it was designed to suit the interests of American grain producers and American shippers. And there is an argument that by bringing together the American grain producers, the American cargo carriers, and the American foreign aid sector in one kind of sort of political lobbying group, that has an advantage for foreign aid. But that's rather like saying that you need to get the political lobby together in order to protect itself,
Yeah, what's interesting also is that now these days, on top of these political lobbies, there are also celebrities, musicians, and also movie stars. They involved in this promoting food aid. I think one of the challenges of this program is those stakeholders, they haven't identified, for example, who are the key players. Right now, these celebrities, the movie stars, musicians, donor organizations, and recipient organizations, recipient governments, these are dictators. So do you think that those stakeholders should redefine who should be the key players, who should have say in this food aid program?
In the food aid program? Well, there are not many celebrities necessarily involved in the food aid program. I mean, if you take an example of a celebrity project which did not work well, you can take Madonna's project in Malawi for developing local schools. She was trying to develop a group of elite schools in Malawi, which the government knew very little about, and which was done without much contact with the local educational authorities, and which came to grief. Not surprisingly, a lot of money was wasted. No schools were ever built. And that's a sort of bad example of a celebrity project. My view of the celebrity role in development assistance is, yes, of course, people like Bono and Bob Geldof and so on, all the pop stars who, in fact, I think put together a concert for Bangladesh during a time of serious famine, and similarly for Ethiopia, I think in the Ogaden crisis, the same thing happened. Well, of course, we're talking about emergency help here, and as I said before, emergency assistance and developmental assistance are different things. If pop stars can get together millions of dollars for emergency assistance to save lives in a famine or a flood, then we don't have a quarrel with that at all, okay? Provided it's done, in a sensible way, where grain is not necessarily brought all the way from the United States on American ships, taking 2 months to arrive, by which time the famine is over.
Many people died.
Yeah. So there has to be local sourcing.
So if the target is eradicating poverty, for example, using food aid, my question is why these stakeholders engage the key players. The key players for me are local organizations, developmental organizations, and also the poor. Without empowering the poor, there is no way that these stakeholders could be able to eradicate poverty. So do you think that the poor, the key players here in eradicating poverty are neglected by donor organizations and governments because they are just dealing with dictators, trying to eradicate poverty? And as you know, dictators, they have their own agenda. If you remember, Human Rights Watch caught Mullah Zenawi, who was favoring food aid to his supporters and denying poor people to get food aid. So why don't they engage the poor, the key players in this process?
All right, so this is a difficult question because my view is that donors have to trust governments in the end. Because unless they trust governments, if they bypass the government, then the government will never be able to function effectively. Because if you get millions of dollars coming in around the government, the legislature and the executive, that they're responsible for these millions or tens of millions of dollars, but they have no control over them, and they have no experience of actually budgeting for them, including them in the budgets, and so on. They don't become part of the governmental process. If you're talking about a dictatorial government, or if you're talking about a completely corrupt government, then of course there is a problem. And what do you do? As I say, my view is that foreign aid must go through the government, where the government is efficient and responsible. If the foreign donors know that the government is hopelessly corrupt, then they have to find other ways of doing this. And in fact, if you take, and in fragile states where the government is simply not in control of large parts of the country, like say Somalia, again, donors, if they really want to go into Somalia, they will have to bypass the government if the government cannot provide the kind of controls and the kind of due diligence and the kind of capacity that is needed, in which case they should use different kinds of vehicles, such as business grant programs, which go straight to the enterprises, or cash transfer programs, which go straight to the families. But even then, they're going to have to get some clearance through the authorities, because if aid donors go in loose cannons all over the country, you've got a chaotic situation.
But the government could be, rather than the administrator of the food program, the government could be one of the key players in terms of making decisions, for example, where the food should go, how it should be administered. But right now, what we see is the government itself is involved in the day-to-day operation of the aid program, and they are politically motivated, and they are also corrupt. So when I say the government should not engage in this, in the administration of food aid program, I don't mean that the government should be totally cut off from the program. At least they could be decision makers, part of the decision makers in terms of administering. But right now they are the administrators. They are the one and only decision makers in terms of who is getting the food and who's not getting.
Right, and that I agree is wrong. If you've got a corrupt government, if you've got a government which is simply doesn't have the capacity to actually doesn't control most of the country, then if you really want to supply aid to certain remote parts of the country, then you have no choice but to go in parallel with the government, or to go in through local authorities, for example. But nevertheless, as you rightly say, the government must be involved somewhere. If the government is not involved at all, then the program will probably grind to a halt, because the government will work against it. And the idea of donors setting up parallel governments is exactly the kind of thing I regard as a serious problem with foreign aid. You cannot have, 25 separate donors who effectively are making 25 different budgets with 25 different sets of objectives and 25 different kinds of procurement procedures. This is just a recipe for complete chaos. Regardless of the government.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
One point I also see here is that not only these key stakeholders fail to identify the key players like the poor and local governments, they also fail to identify the root cause of poverty. Why they don't identify the root cause of poverty? Right now it looks like they're just putting out resources without identifying. For example, is the poor the one who is responsible for poverty because they are lazy or what have you? Or is it the environment? Or is it the government? Or is it policy issue that is causing poverty?
Yeah. Well, here we get to a question which I think is touching on what some people call the dependency syndrome. Okay, in relation to food aid in particular, quite a lot of donors made a decision some years back that one of the main reasons why, for example, a country like Ethiopia was chronically dependent upon food aid, because large proportions of the population, as many as 10 or 20% of the population, have been dependent on food aid at various times in the past, over the past 3 or 4 generations. And the answer to that continued dependency in the eyes of some donors and some commentators is some sort of dependency syndrome, whereby food aid changes people's behavior. So they change people's behavior, and people start to anticipate the arrival of food or free food, and therefore it changes their incentives. They no longer have the incentive to go out and kind of find work and so on. But then there have been studies that have come out against that. I mean, for example, they point out that even in the poorest parts of Ethiopia, food aid has actually only been quite a small proportion of the total value of their income, and they find that people actually go out and do a lot of other things. One of the things they do during a famine is migrate, for example, or they take up petty trading, or there's all kinds of other activities which research has found family members take up in order to try and compensate for the lack of income from food. The other point that's been made is food aid is very unreliable. Food aid, even emergency food aid, is very unreliable because different countries have different procurement policies, and taking this country again, Canada, and possibly some other European countries, a lot of the food aid has to be shipped out from the provider country. And it takes a very long time, and research has shown at the household level that very often the food aid actually arrives too late, and the damage has already been done. So it's not reliable. Now, in order to show that people are changing their behavior because they think food is coming, you have to, number one, it has to be an important component of their consumption, and number two, it has to be reliable. They have to know that it's coming at a certain time. Then they will change their behavior, because they think it's coming in. But if they don't know if it's going to come in at all, or if it is, they don't know if it's going to come in, in September or the following March, then they can't rely on it anyway. So it's the argument that they are dependent on it, and they're changing their behavior because they think it's going to be there for them. That argument would not hold. It's a very weak argument. So the dependency argument, therefore, has been challenged and is a weak argument. And my view is that families who regular, well-meaning and well-intentioned families, they don't wait for handouts. They try to do the best they can, and they prefer not to have handouts.
So in this case, the issue is a little bit complex, but there should be a mix of solutions. For example, the farmers, the poor should also be educated and empowered, and also the right policies should be in place, and the system and the people who administer the leadership should also be effective leaders, fair and character-based leaders, so that food aid programs to succeed and alleviate poverty.
Yeah, that's the ideal situation. Unfortunately, the ideal doesn't really apply very often.
Is there any way that the donor organization could be able to intervene, because they are the one giving the food?
Well,
should not they put in place some kind of preconditions to give food, so that the government, the leadership, the recipients should really modify their behaviors, prepare themselves, and execute some plans so that they could be able to eradicate poverty?
Well, the history of applying conditions to foreign aid is a very bad one. That is to say, it's very, very difficult for donors to know what kind of conditions to apply. These are not banks making loans where they can set out very specific conditions. And the whole history of World Bank conditionality and IMF conditionality, as you know, has been very fraught with problems. Now, so my view is this, that let's say, if at all possible, local legislative bodies must be brought into the equation. If the central government cannot be trusted, then the donors have to go through the local government apparatus. If they can't be trusted, they have to go through the county or community councils and so on. But at all costs, there must be representatives of the people involved in the design and implementation of these programs, and they must buy into these programs willingly, otherwise these programs will not work. And that's the lesson of all development assistance. I'll give you an example quickly. If you go back to the 30 years or so, there was a movement in the United States and Britain to provide what they call intermediate technology farming equipment to villages in Africa and South Asia and Latin America. And these included things like pedal-powered machinery. Okay, this pedal-powered machinery looked very good in a British university engineering campus, where everybody was trying it out and saying how good it was. But when you go to a village, you immediately come up against unintended problems. Like, first of all, you find out the women cannot operate these pedal-powered threshers. Therefore, the men have to do it, but the men are not going to do it, because traditionally the men did not pound the grain, and therefore you're asking for social changes which are not going to happen. I'll give you another quick example. In one Asian country, water pumps were put in a village. But the donors couldn't understand it when the women wouldn't use the water from the pumps. Why wouldn't they use the water from the pumps? Because they much preferred to go down to the river, where they could spend 1 hour chatting with each other. It was the only time of day they got away from their houses, away from their husbands, away from their children, where they could talk to each other. And that was very important to them. So what I'm saying is, when you design programs at the local level, if you don't have local participation freely given, you're not going to. It's not going to work. You can't go in there and just implant things which nobody understands.
So food aid, like other development efforts, should not be from top to bottom. It should always go at the bottom and consult the local.
I'll give you a good example why that is. This is a technical example. How can Canadian wheat be provided to countries where people are used to eating rice or cassava or some other kind of grain, teff, some other kind of grain? First of all, it's a different kind of food. People are not sure. People don't necessarily like it. Secondly, the cooking preparation technology is different, and you get a situation where you get completely inappropriate kinds of grains being provided, and people don't know what to do with them. And that is like a technical problem. And that, if you don't have any local buy-in, and you provide rice to a maize-consuming community, then you're wasting a lot of time and a lot of money. So, in other words, even in cases of emergency food aid, you've really got to understand what's wanted on the ground.
Interesting.